Well, Mark already kind of told you my story a little bit, so I won't spend a ton of time there. He asked us to kind of focus in to give you just some helps on maybe taking those next steps into multiplication, multi-site, planting a campus, what all goes into that. And so I'm pretty new at it. Like he said, I just started shaving, so I'm not that old at many things, and I'm pretty new at the church leadership level and new to multi-site. We have 4 campuses right now. We're still feeling our way out in that, and we've got a lot of goals to see this multiply beyond there. So I'm not an expert. I'm not a doctor. I have a BA, man. That's it. And but we're learning as we go. And I can say from experience, I have figured out a few things and learned a few things that come just from reproducing as a church. And so I thought I might take us through maybe just some of those things that I've figured out and found out, realizations I've had since reproducing as a church. I remember when my wife and I were expecting our first child, we went to the hospital and we went through one of those prenatal classes. Anybody? And it was mildly horrifying, but really helpful to find out, what to expect when you have a baby. And so if I could just give you a few handles on, for those of you who are thinking about, hey, we might plant a site, we might launch a church, what's going to happen when we do that? I've got a few realizations, and you can just write these down as we go. Here is your church multiplication, multi-site prenatal class. Let's go. Number one, here's the first thing you have to realize, and I think if you've had kids before, you have realized this. You have no idea. You have no idea, but I want to encourage you to tell you know enough. You ever notice that the people who know the most about parenting are people who don't have kids? The time that I was the best parent was the time pre-kids. I remember my wife and I, when we were pregnant with our daughter, our first child, man, we had assumptions. We used to judge my brother-in-law in the way that he would parent his kids. We would never do it like that. And we were going to invite our daughter into our world and not, let her take over our lives. But we were going to schedule things, and we would use like hypoallergenic, gluten-free, fair trade, free-range cloth diapers only. And we had great plans. And then the baby happened. And all of a sudden, we just throw all those plans just get blown up, and all of a sudden it's survival mode. Anyone? I just want to friggin' sleep. Would someone put the kid, go buy diapers from Costco that are gonna be here in 6,000 years? I don't care. Yeah, anybody, am I the only person? Does that happen on the West Coast too? Yeah. It absolutely blows up everything. It's this great disruption when you have a child. And in a similar way, if you launch a campus or you launch a church out of your church, it's going to be a disruption. But what I've found, though, and what I've found in my own life when I became a dad, is that when one baby enters the world, another one exits. And nothing matures you like having a child. Am I right? Nothing forces you to grow up like having a kid. I remember early on when I just had a kid, a buddy of mine called me at 9:30 at night, and he's like, hey man, we're going to a concert, you want to come? And I go, do you have any idea what time it is? It is 9:30, right? Because I grew up and I'd left him in his stage. And the same thing happens, though, when you launch out in a multi-site and you start launching campuses. In a beautiful way, the trauma of multiplication actually forces your church to step forward in a new level of maturity. You have to put away some things. You have to let some things go, and you have to choose to step forward. There are few shocks to the system, few shocks to your church like reproducing, few shocks to the system like stepping out and giving birth to a new campus. Nothing matures you as a parent like having a baby, and nothing matures a church like multiplication. Many of us miss the blessing of spiritual maturity in our churches because we're unwilling to deal with the trauma of multiplication. And there is a blessing, there is a version of your church, and there is a version of your leadership that will never be uncovered until you take that step and you actually multiply. And so there is a version that God has dreamed and placed inside of you that will come out when you step out and do that. Just the same way that, hey, you had a baby, you realized I didn't know what I was talking about, but hey, we survived and now I'm here and things have settled and I'm a different person because of it. It happens to you in the church. So you need to know Up front, you have no idea, but it's in you. You know enough to take that step. Number two, if you're taking notes, write this down. I'd say this: there's never a perfect time to have a baby. Am I right? Like, you ever talk to people who are deliberating? They're not having infertility issues. They're having commitment issues on actually stepping forward and do it. Well, we just want to make sure that our finances are in a better place, or, we've got to have a bigger house, or I want to have a little more job security. And those of us who have had kids, you realize it's such a disruption anyway that you're trying to create an ideal world for this baby who's going to be born into a world that's not ideal anyway. Right? There's no perfect time to have a baby, and the same goes for your church. Now, there are optimal times, and we'll get to that, but you got to understand something. If you're looking for an excuse not to plant a site, there are copious amounts available, and you can find an excuse day after day to never plant. If you're waiting until you're totally and perfectly ready, you will be waiting for a very long time. You will always have a degree of unsettledness. That's where faith comes into the picture. Here's something I have become convinced of, and I'm young, and I think I've been finding this out over and over again. I found this out about God, that God will bless Great Commission stupidity over overly cautious scarcity all day. He absolutely will. Like when we launched our first campus, I called a guy who had been in ministry for like 60 years, like a legend in our area. And I asked him, I said, hey, I think we're going to plant a site. I feel compelled to that part of the city. Here's what we're going to do. Should we do it? And he said, no, you shouldn't do it yet. You need more time in leadership. Your church needs more time to heal. And I hung up the phone and we did it anyway. And I look back on that and I would say he was totally right. We did so much wrong with our first launch, and yet our hearts were in a posture before God that said, God, we feel like this is where you're calling us. We feel like this would honor you. We feel like this would reach people. And so we did it, and God blessed it. Because God can't resist faith, can he? He can't resist the heart that says, I believe you, and I believe you reward those who diligently seek you. And I see a mission field out here that I can't afford because I'm uncomfortable to just press pause any longer. Because that's what we're doing, right? If you're uncomfortable to take the step, you're doing it at the cost of souls. Like, if this is really urgent and this is really an emergency and getting the gospel to people really matters, then we actually have to take that seriously and take those steps. So God will bless you, and realize there's never a good time to have a baby or to launch a church. Third thing I'd say is this: conception is easy. Parenting takes work. You know what I mean? I'm going to not try to tread too close to a metaphor here, but conceiving for our part is fun. And if it's not fun, you're doing it wrong. What's he talking about? And it's very easy to come to a conference like this and talk multiplication, talk dreams, talk vision. But I'll tell you what, a lot of dreams die in conversation, don't they? And sometimes it feels good to say, yeah, well, someday we hope to plant this or do that. And I would just say it's really easy to talk about it. It's really easy to fool around with the idea, but never actually do it. And I remember, my brother-in-law literally is here, bro, earmuffs, because I'm talking about your sister. But I remember when we got serious about wanting to have a child. Can I go there? Is this too crass? When we got serious about having a child, what did we do? I mean, you get busy. You schedule it. Right? You make plans. You're like, no, we are going to have a child. And you start getting into the times of the month and the moon and all this stuff. You're working it out so that we can have a baby. We're serious about it. We're not just talking about it. We're not fooling around. And I think I'd encourage some of you, stop fooling around with the idea. Stop playing around with it and get serious about the fact that God has called his church to reproduce. He's called his church to multiply. Conception's easy, parenting takes work. Number 4, and I think the other guys are going to talk about this, so I won't spend a lot of time here, but I have found this out to be true both in life and in church multiplication. Babies are expensive. Babies cost stuff, don't they? Not just money, cost time, cost emotions, cost relationships, it costs all kinds of things. And you know going in it's going to cost you, and then you find out it costs you more than you thought it was going to cost you. And the same is true when it comes to launching sites and launching campuses. It just costs something, and it's possible to under-resource, it's possible to over-resource, but you have to understand when you go in, it's gonna cost you. All right, number 5, I wanna talk about this. Everyone should reproduce, just not everyone. Everyone should reproduce, just not everyone. When God created humans, what did he say in Genesis 1:28? He said, and God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply. That is God's blessing to humankind. But we know in the fallen world that we live in, some people should not reproduce, correct? Like you can't be in pastoral ministry long and see some of the heartbreak that you see some kids, the homes that they're living in, or broken homes even, or orphans, right? Like my brother, I know I've referenced him a couple times. Him and his wife are fostering a little guy that, you know what, he was born into a dysfunctional family. And the same goes when it comes, when we talk about them, we would say like, hey, you know what? There's a certain degree of health you need before you reproduce. It's interesting that God said, be fruitful and multiply, not multiply and be fruitful. I think we get those reversed, don't we? Sometimes we think multiplication is going to be a means to fruitfulness, and it's the other way around. Fruitfulness, multiplication is the byproduct or an overflow of fruitfulness. And so some of you might be thinking about planting a site. I would say this. I would ask you, is it fruitful? Are you seeing new life? Are you seeing growth? Are you seeing things happen? Because you will reproduce, you will multiply what you are. And that's what will happen. So everyone should reproduce. That's the call of God. God has called every church, every people to be fruitful and multiply. This is the mandate. But I would say don't multiply before you're fruitful. Everyone should reproduce, just not everyone. Number 6, I'm going to be done on time. They told me 20 minutes, and I thought I'd get through this. Number 6, here's what you need to know. Reproducing, babies are messy. Anybody ever found that out? Any parents? Am I talking to parents in this room? Where are the PAOCs? My goodness. Yeah. Babies are messy, aren't they? They're messy. When they come in, they mess everything up. You get your hands dirty, you get thrown up on, and other things. The house is in disarray. Nothing makes a mess out of your life, out of your nice, neat little home, like having a child. I think one of the biggest reasons some churches and church leaders don't ever take that step and multiply is because if they do, it's going to mess something up they are unwilling to get dirty. It might be messing up their philosophy of what a good church does. It might be messing up their systems. It might be messing up their finances. It might be messing up their old strategy. It might be messing up their paradigm. But I find that if you are going to get serious about reproduction and multiplication, it will mess things up. Churches and leaders often have things nice and neat and tidy, and reproducing just makes a mess of them. It'll mess up your focus, it'll mess up your finances, it'll mess up your traditions, it'll mess up your relationships, it will mess up your church model, it will mess up your philosophy. But you know what else it does? It messes up, I've found this, it messes up and can expose idolatry and selfishness masquerading as theology and mission. I find reaching people, like really reaching people, requires a degree of messiness that I am not always comfortable with. I thought it was so awesome yesterday to hear Mr. Winter, I forget his first name, but ministering to the First Nations talking about, what was it called, a swipe or something? The smudge. Yeah. Like, that's messy stuff. Like, does your theology permit you to go in and get smudged? Right? For the sake of the gospel? It should, but a lot of the time our nice, neat little philosophy does not allow us to go and reach the people Jesus would have us reach. And sometimes I've been confronted with, in myself, that there's that propensity to be like the guys that Jesus was talking about in the parable of the Good Samaritan, the priest and the Levite, who because of the system they built, because of the structure they were within, because of their assumptions of how they were honoring God, they weren't able to actually go over and care for the person that Jesus said needed care for. And I find sometimes in our churches, we can very easily do this. We can very easily not want to touch the things that Jesus wants to touch. I was really checked one time. I've had the privilege of being mentored by a guy in the States in a really large church, and it's been very helpful to me because we are a large church in an area where there aren't large churches, so getting just that information has been very helpful. But he really checked me one time because I went down there and he was telling me about this thing they did, and we would just never do this. He was talking about they do the At the Movies preaching series, right? And I was kind of sitting there with a little bit of a smug look, like, come on, man, I want to preach from Jumanji. I preach from Jude or something. I preach from the Bible. And he could pick up my judgment. And he looked at me, and I'm not advocating that you should go home and do At the Movie series. We don't do it either, and that we're not going to start. But he caught me on something that I had to repent of. And he looked at me and he said, what's a soul worth to you? Like, what is a soul worth to you? At the end of the day, like if I know what Jeff talked about yesterday, we got to train people up, we got to get rooted in this, we got to bring people to maturity. But at the end of the day, when it comes to like getting Jesus, getting the gospel to someone, would you not sit on the Millennium Falcon if that's what it took? Right? Like, and he said, like, I will be a Wookiee. I will go first and then say, Jesus loves you if that's what it takes. I think that's what Paul was getting at when he said, I will become all things to all people that I might win some. What if all things is a little outside of what your traditions have been? What if all things is a little outside of what your philosophy even has been? Because I think that's what Jesus does. He just disrupts things. Isn't that what Paul is getting at in Philippians 2? Like, Jesus touched messy things. My mentor looked at me and he said, if you want to reach the culture, you're going to have to touch it. And whatever that looks like might look different for your church, but at the end of the day, you have to roll up your sleeves and touch the world that God is trying to touch through his body. And that is what Jesus has done. That's what Paul's saying in Philippians 2. What's he saying? He's saying, have the mind of Christ, who in very nature did not see his divine nature as something to be grasped, right? But he gave up his divine privileges, humbled himself, took on flesh, and died a sinner's death. He became a servant. That's what the gospel is, isn't it? The gospel touches the mess. I think we as churches have to take that seriously, that if we are going to be a reproducing church, you just got to know going in, it's going to mess some stuff up. It's going to mess your paradigms. It's going to mess your systems. It's going to mess all of those things up. But I'll say this, and I'll leave you with this, and I'll kick it over to Mark Clark here. But at the end of the day, though, with all the mess, the shock and awe of stepping out and becoming a parent, the cost, all of those things, you've got to understand this. Multiplication is a gift from God. It's a blessing. It is an absolute blessing. I mean, like last weekend, as Mark was saying, we baptized 67 people across our campuses. There were people in neighborhoods that we had no name for, that because we went to those neighborhoods, they heard the gospel, they put their faith in Christ and said, I want to be baptized. And that is a gift I would never trade. And all the trauma and all the difficulty and all the cost, that makes it worth it, doesn't it? And what parent has ever had a kid that said, yeah, I'd trade you back? You wouldn't, would you? You say in some crazy way it's worth it, because the gift that comes through the mess and through the stress is a blessing that you would never trade back. Psalm 127 says this, children are a heritage from the Lord, offspring a reward from him. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior are children born in one's youth. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. I would say blessed is the church whose quiver is full of children reproducing. Realize that these, if you're launching sites, it's going to be hard, but in the end you get a baby. You get a blessing that you would never trade back. I'm going to kick it over to Mark and see what he has to say. Thank you.